I'm not sure how many newer anime fans realize just how prominent and popular Your Lie in April ended up being around the time it had finished airing in spring of 2015. In fact, it's funny to think back to how when it first started in fall of 2014, it really was not amongst the most discussed and popular shows of that season. Things like Parasite and Yona of the Dawn and other shows definitely overshadowed it at the time, but once it got into its second half in winter of 2015, it definitely started to get more and more popular and gain more and more prominence amongst the anime community. And when it finally ended, it was everywhere. It was very high up on places like My Anime List in terms of where it was ranked. It was constantly being praised as this amazingly emotional romantic drama. It would often be compared to other very well-regarded, prominent, emotional romantic dramas like Clannad, which helped it to garner a very respectable reputation. And for me, it became this show that I put on a pedestal well before I ever watched it. Because I was someone who really wanted to wait for the dub to come out, which would not happen for another year before I actually watched it. So for that year, from March of 2015 until March of 2016, when the dub came out and was actually put on Netflix very conveniently, I spent all that time hyping this show up in my mind. Because Clannad was still a very recent watch for me. I had only watched it in the end of 2014, and it very easily became one of my favorite anime. It still is my 5th favorite anime. So even now, if someone were to say, hey, go watch the show, it's just like Clannad, I would jump on it immediately. But back then, especially, I was very eager to find more shows that would make me feel like Clannad, like Canon, these romantic drama shows that were very satisfying. That's what I really, really wanted. And because this show so often got compared to those kinds of shows, to Canon, to Clannad, to other romance anime that I respected and loved, I ended up expecting quite a lot out of Your Lie in April. And to have that festering in my mind, building and building on itself for a year, very likely gave me unreasonable expectations for this show, despite the fact that, as I said, it was topping all of these ranking lists. You would often see it on people's top 10 lists. It was very well regarded amongst the community, so it wasn't as though it was unfounded to expect a lot out of it, but I think the expectations I ended up having for it, in hindsight, were probably never going to be met. So when I finally got to watch it in March of 2016, I really thought this was going to end up being like a top 10 anime for me. I wasn't necessarily thinking it was going to top Clannad, but I thought, hey, if it's being compared to this, I'm expecting it to really, really place highly. And often when I end up doing that, the show ends up not living up to my expectations. Sometimes it's not because the show is bad or does anything wrong. It just isn't able to do things that are quite frankly unreasonable. Like, it ends up being my own fault for expecting so much out of it. In this case, I don't think my unreasonable expectations are the entire issue here. Your Lie in April is a mixed bag, and a lot of that comes down to, unfortunately, how the actual primary romance is handled. On the one hand, it's not as though you have a lot of cringeworthy drama being thrown at you. So if you're not a fan of things being really melodramatic, which even at the time, I was not a fan of that, you could find it very refreshing in that respect. On the other hand, and this is the much bigger issue, the romance itself between Kosei and Kaori honestly does not feel justified. It doesn't feel like a real, genuine romance. If anything, it comes off more like admiration for each other because of what they were able to achieve in terms of their musical prowess. That I believe. I don't believe that they love each other romantically. Even though they do end up saying this, certainly by the end, it just doesn't feel justified. And, you know, this isn't like a super short show, like it's 23 episodes, which isn't crazy long, but it's enough to introduce these characters, give them some backstory, have them meet each other, and develop a natural romance. It's not as though we're talking like 12 episodes and maybe it was too unreasonable to expect it to develop that romance in a fulfilling way in a short period of time. That's not what we're dealing with. They had plenty of time to pull it off, and for me at least, they did not achieve that. The whole kind of basis of their relationship is that Kaori's playing allows Kosei to be able to overcome his past and actually enjoy playing piano again. And the show does like to throw around this idea that he needed someone to love and to play for. So it's not as though the show wasn't trying to push this romance, even with the amount of time they spend together and their interactions and how important they're supposed to be to each other. I genuinely cannot believe that they love each other. in that way. Again, admiration, I believe that. But love, it just isn't there. And it's kind of funny, towards the end of the show, there's even a scene, and this has stood out in my mind since I watched it. Kaori straight up says that they barely know each other, and yet they love each other. And okay, you know, suspension of disbelief, you can kind of get by that if you're already feeling the romance, but to have a show that did not, in my mind, make the romance feel like it had been properly built up, despite trying to, and then have one of the two characters outright say, yeah, we barely know each other, it doesn't make sense that we like each other. You know, admitting a problem is not the same thing as fixing the problems. It doesn't make the issue of this romance feeling so weak somehow go away just because the show admits to us, yeah, the romance is kind of weak. And it really doesn't help that Kaori being hospitalized basically takes her out of the action for a decent portion of the series. Ultimately, the lack of time allotted for them to spend time with each other prior to her hospitalization, the lack of real knowledge and understanding about each other, and the lack of this gradual growth and development over time from their interactions, it just makes the romance ultimately feel forced. I honestly kind of feel like it would have worked better if it wasn't trying to be a romance. If Kosei just saw her as a friend who he admired and cared about, certainly, because of how much of a positive impact she ended up having on his life. But as a romance, I just could not be invested in it. Of course, I guess I should point out that there is this sort of love triangle aspect with Tsubaki being thrown in there too. And I suppose because of what ends up happening to Kaori, the thing that everybody knows about the show before even watching it, it is somewhat interesting that the implication at the end is that Kosei will end up with Tsubaki. So, like, you could argue that both girls kind of win in the end. Okay, that's kind of refreshing in a sense, but I don't know how many people are going to necessarily love that or love that there's even this attempt at a love triangle in the first place. And I suppose, in addition to the romance, we do need to talk about the other prominent aspect of this show, which is the music. And I am not someone who typically loves shows that focus on people playing in bands or performing with their instruments. It's just something that, for whatever reason, has never been something that's grabbed me. And whenever I watch a show where that is the main prominence, especially recently when we've had show after show of characters forming a band, you know, something about it just does not click with me. It just does not appeal. And I don't know why, and I know that that's a very specific and personal criticism, but because the show is pretty sizably focused on these characters playing their music, it just does not appeal to me specifically. One thing I certainly can't do anything but commend the show for is its portrayal of Kosei's struggle with his mother's expectations for him to perform well at piano playing. It is very difficult to watch, seeing the way that she does emotionally and sometimes even physically abuse him because she expects so much from him, because she wants him to achieve so much from this. But the moments where that is shown are very poignant. They do stick with you because it shows just how toxic and dangerous expectations can be. How living up to those expectations is far from easy, even for people who are genuinely very talented. And forcing all of that onto a child and having all of those expectations come from their parents, it's awful. It's a really, really terrible thing to see someone go through. And even though generally the stuff with the music did not mean that much to me, I cannot deny that those moments of backstory showing what Kosei's relationship with his mother was like, it's very sad, and it is the sort of thing that will stick with you. Because unfortunately it is, for a lot of people, a very accurate portrayal of what it's like to have these expectations thrusted onto you and not be able to live up to them, because in many cases you can never live up to them. And I think that transitions well into why exactly I made this video, because why am I bothering to talk about a show from a decade ago, a show that I watched nearly a decade ago, and a show that ultimately did not mean anywhere near as much to me as I wished it had? Well, it all comes back to expectations. I expected something from this show that was not realistically ever going to be met. And that is a problem that I and many others have had watching anime or consuming any piece of media. Sometimes you just get an idea in your head that a certain show is going to be a 10 out of 10 or part of your top 10, something that you are going to love well before you ever watch it. And sometimes those expectations will be met. Sometimes you will expect to love a show and you will love a show, and that is an amazing feeling. But other times, it just won't happen. And even if a show is still good, even if it's still great, even if it's a show you still enjoy, the simple fact that you expected it to be more can leave this really awkward and frustrating taste in your mouth. I don't think that if I went into Your Lie in April blind or with lesser expectations, that I would have loved the show. I just don't think, given what this show presents, that would be possible for me personally. That being said, I don't think the disappointment I felt while watching it would have stuck with me this long if my expectations for it were not so inflated. So if there is anything you take away from this video, it should be to try to keep your expectations in check. That's not to say you shouldn't be hyped up for shows or look forward to them. Of course you should, because that's a great feeling to have this excitement building towards something coming out, this anticipation. Those are good things. Those are joyous things. But in my experience, viewing certain shows as though they're going to be guaranteed 10 out of 10s, as though they're definitely going to rank amongst your top anime or your top any sort of piece of media, can very easily result in disappointment. And I think we could all use a little bit less disappointment in our lives. Let me know what you think down below in the comments. Like and subscribe if you enjoyed. And until next time, take care, everyone. Look forward to the next video.